It's very nice of you to welcome me, but I'm not a professor. I was once an assistant professor, which, as you all know, is quite different. But I'm really here today as a philanthropist and perhaps as a participant observer of being involved with universities as a philanthropist for so many years now. The Oxford Don and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis once began a speech by saying that since the organizers had invited a middle-aged moralist, then, however unlikely it seemed, they must have wanted to hear the views of a middle-aged moralist. You have invited an amateur philanthropist, and so I will assume, optimistically if improbably, that you want to hear the views of an amateur philanthropist. And today I will present a very simple view. Universities can and must embrace open access of academic research to ensure their future public legitimacy. And if you will just excuse me, I'll take my glasses. Open access is often visualized as a one-dimensional line from the extreme to middle of the road to status quo. But this unhelpfully defines open access in terms of degree of compliance with copyright law. It's a narrowly descriptive concept anchored in the status quo. Let's instead divide open access into domains, and let's leave Hollywood to Hollywood. The academic corpus is different from that of the content providers or entertainment industry, to use their own terms. Let those who live from their work sell their works on the open market, but publicly funded research should be in the public domain. If free downloads of popular culture is not our cause, it is our misfortune. Hollywood has hijacked copyright legislation without a thought for higher education. That universities fall under film industry laws is in essence accidental. We are Hollywood's roadkill. But that universal and paramount rules Harvard and Berkeley is absurd. Our corpus is not Mission Impossible or Pretty Woman. It's the research of the salaried intelligentsia, or as Lawrence Lessig would say, it's the scientific literature and the corpus needed to source critique or replicate it. Nor is the call for open access new or radical. It follows in scholarly traditions back to the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions of 1665. Henry Oldenburg, the then Secretary of the Royal Society, regarded his journal as we regard open access, a practical tool to improve earlier forms of scholarly communications. In his case, correspondent networks. In our case, for-profit publishing. Today, as you know, only a minuscule fraction of the world's publications are freely available to the public in digital form. Globally, over 120 million books are out of print but in copyright, and over 36 million books are in the public domain, but most exist only on paper and most are out of print. A vast body of work is orphaned, presumed to be in copyright but with no known copyright holders. Yet other works are digitalized but languish behind paywalls and nearly always available only to institutional subscribers. At the same time, the corpus is expanding exceedingly fast. About 2.5 million peer-reviewed articles are now published annually in the world. Open access so far has often embraced leftovers, easy to move into the public domain, grey data, archives, older literature. But we must not lose sight of recent top-quality research, the scholarly books, the books of the university presses, the journals. Those are our aims. Nor must our open access quest become a trophy hunt. We mustn't focus only on rare icons, incunabula and illuminated manuscripts, say. We need to make all publicly funded research available online for free. And this is my special plea, we must not forget the humanities and the social sciences. There are many reasons for that focus. First, these are fields more accessible for laymen. The American Civil War engages more reader than quantum gravity. Second, these fields uniquely depend on the vast historical hinterland of human thought. And third, from an open access point of view, the humanities and non-quantitative social sciences are the most primitive. They're monographic or use paywall journals. They use print as much as electronics. Their funding sources typically don't mandate open access, and they don't habitually archive either preprints or postprints. The hard sciences have come further, and some fields like physics and astronomy are arguably functionally open access already. And there are even some open access initiatives for poor countries in the applied sciences, although these initiatives are typically institutional and so benefit only small knowledge elites. So all scholars must publish for their career. The copyright of their publication imposes an artificial scarcity, a scarcity which in turn generates money value, although not for the scholars themselves. They also lose, since their coinage is esteem and closed access means fewer citations. And university libraries lose as well. They spend a lot of money paying for-profit academic presses and commercial journal publishers like Springer, Nature Group, Thomson and Pearson's. In effect, these publishers charge monopoly rents, extractable since each article or monograph is a unique and non-substitutable good, and since researchers can only properly use each article or monograph if all other publications on the subject are also available to them. Moreover, as you know, compared to other forms of publishing, academic publishing has very low costs. As Deutsche Bank noted about Reed Elsevier, quote, "If the process of editing really was as complex, costly and value-added as the publishers protest that it is, 40% margins would not be available." A web commentator explains why, quote, "As an academic publisher, you pay no royalties and no advances. All editing is done for free, and since you sell unique products, all universities must buy whatever the price. Professors give publishers the materials for free and helpfully edit and peer reviews it. The publishers, lucky devils, then sell the material to these same professors through university libraries." Of course, not every publisher's profit go to private shareholders. Academic presses subsidize universities. Oxford University Press contributes over £20 million a year to the Bodleian Library. And some learned society use journals for their modest but deserving outlays. Some recipients within the ivory tower will lose out if we short-circuit the publisher's extraction of rents. And while on the whole open access would save universities a lot of money, some new costs would be incurred, for example, for digital repositories. The conclusion is clear, I think. As a society, the USA must accept that dissemination costs are part of research costs. Publication is an overhead. Like universities and learned societies, scholarly communications must ultimately be public sector funded, whether through grants or tax breaks. They are a public good. Whether federal, state, or philanthropic, research funders should pay for, mandate, and enforce open access. This open access can be provided by university depositories or discipline-specific organizations. The Library of Congress could be a national mirror site or digital repository to ensure technical sustainability, public financial support, a clear preservation mission, and stable governance. Self-archiving or local archives are not enough, because when an online resource fails, it may become completely unavailable. Web technologies keep shifting, and small organizations may not be able to fund their web libraries in perpetuity. We also need extended collective licensing, for example, on the Norwegian model. All books published in Norway are free online to all readers, although, alas, only those readers located in Norway. The right holders who can opt out are paid a small fee per use. Wales has gone further, making its Welsh language corpus open access online to the entire world with authorial opt-out rights. There are, of course, still Welsh language publishers and books, but mostly on paper. Fair use exemptions must be widened for educational and non-profit purposes, and importantly, for data mining and text analytics. Today, you can data mine only 10% of Great Britain's PubMed Central, the open access repository for most of the UK's medical articles, obviously based on the US model. How can we do Cochrane meta-analytics if we cannot crunch the numbers? How can we develop the semantic web if we cannot tag the whole corpus? We need collective mass licensing of orphan works too, by a digital copyright exchange. And we need technology-neutral laws so that poorly drafted copyright statutes do not inadvertently regulate the development of consumer technology. Commercial publishing contracts and licenses often bluff and bluster in ways that override copyright laws. Purchasers must become much more savvy. And arguably, if a contract attempts to override copyright law, its corpus should fall in the open domain. Moreover, fines for breach of copyright should be non-punitive. For example, they could be prorated over the life of the remaining copyright on the average annualized income over the last 10 years, as is indeed the case in some countries. And if I may fantasize, and I underline fantasize, of reforming the Berne Convention, copyright should be asserted, not automatic, and renewable, not automatically extended, as indeed it used to be in Anglo-Saxon jurisdictions. Moreover, if, as Hollywood claims, copyright is intended to encourage creativity, is it too long at 70 years beyond the death of the creator? In the academic realm, at least, only publishers benefit from these 100 years plus average copyrights. Academics rarely retain copyrights and rarely earn significant royalties. But publishers, who increasingly only rent scholarly resources instead of selling them, hold universities essentially at ransom. International copyright legislation based on the Berne model is hard to change. A more realistic daydream might be Justice Department antitrust action suit against journal publishers. The marginal cost, as you know, of an additional web reader is close to zero. There is no link between variable cost and revenues. Nonetheless, when journal publishers allow pay-per-view at all, which isn't often, they charge on average a little over $16 per article. Even public domain items are not publicly available through aggregators. The journal publishers' bundling, rent-only models, differential and extortionate pricing, payment wrap inclusion of public domain items, overtly aggressive commercial clauses, and customer confidentiality clauses should arguably be tested much more rigorously against both EU and US law. It is cheaper to run an open access archive than a paywall archive, and electronics are infinitely cheaper than print. But open access archives have no income sources, and they too cost something. That something needs to be paid somehow, but it shouldn't be paid as it is today. In the institutional subscription model, which essentially that institutional users pay for access to knowledge that the same institutional users have generated, means that university libraries pay for the promise that others, the general public and poorer institutions, will be banned from accessing the materials. And that ban is the profit. Libraries have become academic publishers' main revenue source as copyright restricts public access ever longer. As you know, in 1971, Michael Hart created the first open access electronic text, the American Declaration of Independence. At 6 pages, it was of course far too long to email to the 100 or so people on ARPANET. But 6 people downloaded it, and Hart continued his Project Gutenberg from 1971 to 2011. In those 40 years, the average length of copyright in the US rose from 30 to almost 100 years. I congratulate the University of California for seeking to boycott the Nature Group. But we need broader change. Taxpayers finance the huge upfront cost of creating academic knowledge, labs, libraries, professorial salaries, student grants, and so on. The knowledge creators, professors and their apprentices, validate their knowledge by peer review before giving it away for free, in return for reputational benefits that within the ivory tower translate into resource distribution such as tenure. In this model, citizens and taxpayers cannot gain access to the scholarly knowledge they paid to create and paid to buy back from the publishers. Quote, "I have a PhD but work outside academia," unquote, one web commentator writes. Her local university cannot, quote, "afford journals in my field because the cost is outrageous. About 90% of PhDs are like me. That means tens of thousands of experts have patchy access to what's going on in their field," unquote. What price does the United States pay for banning its most precious resource, its knowledge elites, from accessing publicly funded research once they exit the ivory tower? And what is the upside of paying that price? I would suggest there is none. Universities do not inherently depend on commercial publishing to sort out the hierarchy of status and values. On the contrary, open access publishing has demonstrated positive effects on citation indexes, league tables, and university rankings. And while a journal's ranking in the field matters to academics, most barely notice whether it's for-profit or non-profit, or open access or closed access. In the paper era, academic publishing was sometimes quite gentlemanly, with ideals of the common good. But when the internet radically lowered transaction costs and Hollywood radically extended copyright, entrepreneurs and private equity firms swooped in. Imagine inventing today's system from scratch. Private shareholders extract monopoly rents, and for every piece of research made artificially pricey, many more orphaned and abandoned pieces disappear altogether from public view. It isn't a good model, is it? Copyrighted academic resources exemplify market failure, not free market. They impose an artificial scarcity. As a consequence, unintended perhaps, but real nonetheless, commercial academic publishing prevents spillover of knowledge. By logical default, it holds back the progress of knowledge, and thus technological invention, economic growth, and societal benefits. If academic scholarship were open access, researchers would match, map, and test data sets much more easily. The public would engage in crowdsourcing, and poorer academic institutions, indeed every citizen, would become as data-rich as wealthy universities. Already splendid examples show the way. Websites where amateurs and scholars collaborate, Citizen Science, Folding at Home, Galaxy Zoo, Encyclopedia and Life, and so on. And this is, of course, a long tradition. Lay people have long participated in science. Think of the Audubon Society's Christmas bird count, started in 1900, or the many county floras of England. But today, as the web causes transaction costs or the hassle factor to tumble, untold forces can be unleashed. Amateurs are astoundingly productive. At the Old Weather website, 11,000 volunteers transcribed a set of Royal Navy logbooks in 6 months. The project scholars believe that without this help, it would have taken them 28 years. At Oxford Brinkers Online, volunteers help transcribe papyrus fragments, including parts of non-canonical Gospels, found in Upper Egypt. Math wizards turn to Math Overflow, where you earn reputation points for solving math problems, or the Polymath Project, when they comment on a blog by field medalist and Cambridge professor Timothy Gowers. If copyright was less stifling, we would have many more such websites. Indeed, if it wasn't for copyright restrictions and commercial vested interests, there could be a new Alexandrian library in every home, school, place of worship, town hall, and community center in America, and indeed the world. As the Harvard University librarian Robert Darnton puts it, we could issue, quote, the smallest junior college in Alabama and the remotest high school in North Dakota with the greatest library the world has ever known. It would be the most radical good, tool for good, the world has seen, and it would echo humanity's most venerable histories. All we need is public sector will. As Carl Malamud at Harvard puts it, quote, if a self-appointed librarian like Bruce Ducale can publish 3 million books, how can our federal government not do more? If Google can scan 10 million books just to feed its search engine, why can't the federal government do the same to transform our nation's educational system? Unquote. Instead, the commons of knowledge are being enclosed at the very moment they are emerging. But do not people have a right to roam also over the public landscapes of knowledge and thought? But who will enforce that right? Faculty and librarians don't have the power to change this. They don't set university budgets, targets, or goals. Presidents and chancellors, aided by their provosts and deans, do. They speak for the universities in Washington, Silicon Valley, and Hollywood. Yes, we need activist scholars, but more than that, we need activist university presidents. But sadly, the most natural leaders have the least incentive to lead. The more prestigious an academic institution is, the less it needs open access, because its constituent scholars needs it less. That's why the historical black colleges in the South are more interested in open access than the Ivy Leagues, and the Library of Wales is more progressive than the British Library. Excepting CERN, you will find no household names among the pioneers that first mandated open access for their scholars' work. The University of Southampton School of Electronics and Computer Science, Queensland's University of Technology, and Minho University in Portugal. But if ensuring open access of scholarly resources is ultimately the job of university presidents, academics still have a duty to help bring it about. Professors should stop regarding certain journals or presses as proxies for quality control for hiring decisions. Why not mandate that only open access publications count for tenure? Academics must also push their universities to create mandatory opt-out digital repositories for faculty research and PhD, MA, and undergraduate theses. It is excellent that the UC system, quote, reminds faculty members to negotiate the terms of all authors' agreements they sign, unquote. This is from a letter to the faculty. But this is not a battle that can be won professor by professor. It would be a fair exchange for salaries and benefits if universities mandated that their scholars' publications had Creative Commons licenses and were included in open access repositories. And this would also benefit scholars individually. Again, open access publications have higher citation rates. Academics must also ask their university presses to make their long tail of non-income producing monographs open access. And we must brainstorm. New possibilities include open source textbooks, open courseware as at MIT, 4 free web courses like Stanford's KnowLab, and bloggable library catalogs. Such innovations attract students too, and they usefully hold professors to account by opening their classrooms to the world. Most broadly, we need to change our mindset. Let's ban the words, quote, public engagement and outreach, unquote. It is not an add-on. It is at the heart of university's mission. Cambridge University has an excellent slogan, quote, open is the new normal, unquote. Or, as one web commentator more trenchantly put it, quote, and yes, as a lifelong taxpayer, I damn well do feel entitled to convenient access to research I help pay for, unquote. In my view, that anonymous taxpayer is right. To disagree means echoing too closely Marie Antoinette's purported suggestion that the breadless peasantry of France should eat cake. Listen to this academic voice from the web, quote, to be honest, the public isn't going to help bolster new ideas or collaboration. Honestly, how many people desire to read peer-reviewed manuscripts, unquote. Well, lay people are denied access to JSTOR about 150 million times a year. We must not think that this doesn't matter. Like this scholar, again writing on the web, quote, how is a layman supposed to make sense of any particular article and different schools of thought in the same field without prior schooling if you open the floodgates? The fact remains that much of the populace is scientifically illiterate and unable to read above 5th grade level, unquote. Such openly expressed contempt is very rare. But I have heard scholars sometimes say that if members of the public are interested in scholarship, they can visit the library. Really? Think of the trouble and expense of travels. Babysitters and petrol are not free. And in any case, not all people are American. How do you get to university library from rural Mali, central Peru, or eastern Romania? For that matter, how do you get there from the Appalachian countryside, the far reaches of Alaska, or Hawaii's smaller islands? I agree with the web commentator who argues that, quote, being able to walk into a university library is the most ridiculous conceptualization of access I ever heard of, unquote. As another web commentator ironizes, quote, yeah, why have it easier when you can make it as difficult as possible? Let's turn people into academic library tourists just because they want to read 3 articles for the sake of adventure, unquote. Yet some academics still dreamily suggest, for example, that people email academic authors to ask for electronic offprints. Try doing that for Mark Bloch, Paul de Man, or E.P. Thompson, or other long-dead authors. Convenience and curiosity are perfectly valid reasons for open access on their own, given that taxpayers fund research. But lay people have more immediate needs as well. As one journalist writes in The Atlantic, quote, I have a child on the autistic spectrum. I could not access any of the first 200 articles that contained the word autism. I later found one article that was available for $38, unquote. Medicine is the least of our problems, though. Everyone in this room will have second-guessed a doctor by surfing the web. Thank goodness for PubMed. But what if you want to second-guess your economist, your historian, or your sociologist? What if you want to check out the health, not of yourself, but of your neighborhood, city, or country? Unless you're an academic, now you can't use the web, since the humanities and social sciences are hidden behind institutional paywalls. But you still go to the web, don't you? This is Gresham's second law. Bad data drives out good. An Indonesian scholar can find anti-Semitic conspiracy theories on the web, but not authoritatively annotated Quranic variants. A Nigerian civil servant can access well-meaning NGO sites, but little from agricultural institutions or indeed any universities. A Tanzanian park ranger cannot read about the science of the chimpanzees he protects. And this problem exists in the West, too. In England, I know a newspaper editor writing an authorized biography of a major political figure. a city banker editing his letters from the Korean War, and a teacher researching her childhood. None of them have even heard of JSTOR, yet JSTOR is the flagship Anglophone journal aggregation in the humanities and social sciences. And even so, I have met professors who think that JSTOR is public domain. When I tell them it is not, these academics often react by again asking why people don't go to the local library. Well, apart from the hassle factor that we discussed earlier, as one librarian explains on the web, quote, access to interlibrary loan systems does not guarantee free copies and loans. Universities, which tend to be the only holders of many journals, often charge exorbitant fees to those who are not affiliated with the university system. We cannot afford JSTOR, we can't afford the $50 you want for an article either, unquote. And in any case, many libraries only do interlibrary loans for core patrons. As one web commentator writes, quote, the whole line of go to university library to access a database, which after all is being passed to that very university across the same internet that brings data directly into my house, strikes me as well dumb. If it's free in one location, why shouldn't it be free everywhere? Quote, unquote. Another web writer agrees, quote, I thought I was the only person nerdy enough to get upset about losing access to online journals when I graduated from college, unquote. Well, he isn't. My son, a freshman, entranced with the scholarly resources at his American university, already worries about it. I have echoed argumentative-sounding voices from the web. But what's most striking about today's debates on open access is how agreed on basic principles we all are. All agree that in today's knowledge economy, we are all always students, whether in kindergarten to 12th grade, universities, community colleges, vocational schools, adult education programs, web courses, book clubs, or simply as citizens surfing the web. All agree that taxpayers have a right to demand a quid pro quo for their taxes. All agree the public should have access to scholarly resources, and all support free public libraries. The debate comes down to practicalities, not principles. Is access to the physical spaces of public libraries sufficient? And how interested are lay people in scholarship? And even here, most people agree, the laity is eager to learn about university research, and their demand to do so cannot be met solely through public libraries in the sense of buildings designated for digital open access for scholarly resources that remains banned in homes, schools, community centers, and so on. As one web commentator writes, quote, it is not as though I'm demanding that some guy gets on a horse for free with an armload of print journals and deliver them to my house and wait while I read them, unquote. Yet despite this broad agreement across society, and despite splendid effort of open access heroes such as Tim Gowers, Paul Ginsbart, Peter Suber, James Boyle, George Soros, Pamela Samuelson, Robert Darnton, John Norton, Harold Varmus, Patrick Brown, and Michael Eisen, Lawrence Lessig, Brewster Kahle, Michael Hart, and of course many, many other heroes as well, there's still too little response from the political and knowledge elites. Perhaps we academics are akin to the Catholic clergy of the 15th century. As you know, the printing press meant that the church knowledge protocols of history, science, and faith were largely lost in a democratic interpretative frenzy. The knowledge elites, the priests, lost their interpretative monopoly, and indeed across much of Europe their social standing and economic power. Each lay person felt entitled to their own direct and unmediated interpretation of the Bible. One of the end results, of course, was Garrison Keillor's imagined Minnesotan small town, Lake Wobegon, where there are as many Protestant congregations as there are families. Truth splintered into an infinitude of monads. What does today's printing press, the web, signify for the universities that produce today's knowledge protocols? The internet was only created in 1974 and the web in 1991. Yet, as Marshall McLuhan noted, technological twists are societally transformative. Quote, man makes the tools, and then the tools make the man. Unquote. Given the way lay people are excluded from scholarship, how will university research continue in the future to win public support and funding? Perhaps it is true also for universities, and not only for the Sicilian aristocracy, that, as Lampedusa's novel The Leopard has it, quote, in order for everything to stay the same, everything has to change. Will the laity really passively stand by in the future, grateful for whatever dollops of research scholars share with them? Perhaps. But listen to these positively Jacobin voices from the web. Quote, if you want to take away my PubMed, you will have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. Unquote. How many times have I screamed at J. Stowe Wiley, Elsevier, Oxford University Press? Not all of us live in major university towns. Unquote. And quote, we will be Bible smugglers for the glory not of God, but for knowledge. Unquote. It's odd, isn't it, that American citizens conceptualize the reading of the academic research they paid for in terms of Bible smuggling. As I said, primary responsibility rests with university presidents, dean, and provosts. Only universities as corporate bodies have enough heft and weight to change laws and shift costs. Indeed, open access is a question for all universities, working together and with students, faculty, alumni, volunteers, donors, neighboring communities, and the general public. Until that happens, open access successes will remain dispersed and grassroots. Washington politicians will not change the system unless we make them. Of course, university presidents already have a full agenda. Open access falls within the non-urgent but important square, that square which managers typically put off. It is a diffuse problem belonging to everyone and hence no one. And universities already have fine, if 15th century, mechanisms of disseminating knowledge, printing presses, paper, and libraries. We older scholars grew up in a world when nothing else was possible. Perhaps our failure to embrace open access simply signifies a generational lack of imagination. We cannot grasp the opportunity loss. But for non-university affiliated Americans, which is to say the vast majority of Americans, closed access is a problem of the here and now. From their point of view, the key problem with commercial academic publishing is not private shareholders' monopoly profits. It isn't even the economic cost to society, though it is huge. It is the loss of intangible benefits. It's the humiliation of being locked out from the high-quality scholarship they paid for. As one web commentator describes himself, referring to JSTOR's huge annual number of denied hits, quote, I am one of the 150 million. I keep forgetting that the JSTOR address is pointless to me, unquote. How can this man, excluded from the knowledge he paid for, not get the message that the political and academic elites of America don't think he matters, that he has no value? In the pre-electronic era, academic squirreling away of knowledge was rooted in genuine and legitimate costs of transmitting data, as well as in the fragility and scarcity of materials. Techno-change has swept all that away, but mind change is difficult. You remember the old saying, science marches ahead, one funeral at a time. But the generational war is one war whose outcome is certain. Open access must win out. We need open access to show respect for our fellow citizens, to protect universities, to fulfill the historical mission of universities, and to better both universities and societies. Today's political watchwords are transparency, accountability, and legitimacy. Enlightenment concepts all, only reformulated. The UK's National Health Service new slogan, quote, "No decision about me without me," unquote, summarizes the rights of our increasingly empowered citizenry. Privacy legislation notwithstanding, records are magically opening, doctors' notes, court deliberation, federal agencies' plans. In this era of open government, academic data cannot remain closed off. Already, it seems like an extraordinary anomaly that university scholarship remains sealed from the citizens that pay for it. Tomorrow, it may well be regarded as an obscene injustice. Do you remember the highways of Moscow in Soviet times? I saw them many times. They always had one lane reserved from party apparatniks only. No one else could drive on it, and while traffic stood still in the other lanes, they remained splendidly empty, with only an occasional limousine sweeping by. What was true for the Soviet highways then is true for the US information highways today. Sooner or later, we will have to open the lanes and openly share both work processes and work output. And since all universities, private and public, are in essence government funded, and our remit is precisely to discover and disseminate knowledge, we have to take the lead. This is a matter of enlightened self-interest for universities. Again, consider the alternative. If we don't share our work with taxpayers, universities may become largely irrelevant to them, and thus quite possibly ignored and underfunded. Humanity will continue to query itself and its histories. The only question is whether academic research will continue to be interwoven in humanities debates, or whether other forms of knowledge accumulation and theory-making will begin to replace universities, in other institutions perhaps, or perhaps simply in our amorphous, self-organizing World Wide Web. And there are other reasons too why universities may be unwise in excluding people from the research they do on people's communities, psychologies, and histories. Measured scholarship can counteract pernicious mythical narratives of national origins, divine intervention, and so on. Source-critical research promotes a tempered and moderate understanding of the past that shape us, since, as we now know, thanks to source criticism, the past is complex and nuanced, tinged with chance and irony, complexity and tragedy. Rigorous scholarship makes us less rigid. The study of seemingly esoteric subjects, the far away and the long ago, works as a vaccine or antidote to false narratives of imperialism, faith, and patriotism. But, again, academic scholarship must be able to compete on equal terms with the avalanche of unverified and unverifiable revelations of the Internet. Otherwise, we open the door to the myth-makers and troublemakers. As things are today, a curious Egyptian youngsters cannot access the West's secular and source-critical research on Islam, but he can access the Saudi Salafi interpretation of Islam. That is worrisome, both for the boy himself and for his country, and indeed for the US and the world. Open access to academic resources should really be recategorized. It is not a matter of free markets or, as I have argued, lack thereof. It is a matter of US diplomatic and soft power, of cultural reach, and of principled ethics and the furthering of humanity's well-being. It is, if you will, our era's mission civilisatrice, and it's America's greatest chance to repair its global reputation while upholding its scientific lead. You may perhaps object that much scholarship is already on the web, That is true, but web accessibility is in proportion to cognitive complexity. You can access what you can't read, such as string theory. You can read what you can't access, such as English literature. High-energy physics is open access to your grandmother in Omaha, but you can't access an academic history of the homesteaders. That doesn't mean she will stop researching her family history. It only means that academic works don't reach her, nor do they reach people in Pakistan, Serbia, and Sudan, or those many other places in the world where national and religious ideologies are ill-informed and toxic brews, following in spirit the infamous 1968 student slogan from Heidelberg University, "Here wird nicht zitiert," "Here we don't use quotations." Against such ideological attempts to erase the past, contrasts Walter Benjamin's quietly humanist observation, quote, "To write history is to cite it," unquote. But how many articles on Wikipedia have you not seen stating that, quote, "This article needs additional citation for verification," unquote? But how can lay contributors to Wikipedia add these citations when JSTOR is closed to all but academics, as are almost all other academic databases, journals, theses, and monographs? As things stand, ordinary citizens cannot use academic tools to cross-reference data, examine primary sources, or footnote their writing. What will be the consequence? As the web becomes the de facto reference tool for the common man, and indeed also for the educated. And wouldn't open access help universities in the here and now as well? Might not your grandmother in Nebraska email the professor some family documents, enriching his scholarly work? Perhaps academics would benefit from more engagement with connoisseurs, cognoscenti, enthusiasts, and collectors. Moreover, even within the ivory tower, sharing, aggregating, and reusing data can be difficult under current subscription models. Open access would aid the digital humanities, and it would allow social scientists and humanities scholars to join networks such as ResearchGate. The intangible losses of banning the public from accessing academic scholarship are unquantifiable and unknowable. But not everything that can be measured matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. Who knows how societies would change if the calm, empirical voices of academe were given equal footing with the shrill yells and cries of the blogosphere? Who knows? But wouldn't you want to find out? I know I do. I want to set the hive mind free, to interweave the works of amateurs and scholars into one self-correcting global knowledge organism. The hive mind is already busily building its own knowledge networks. Will universities be part of it? Or do we prefer the lonely splendors of our Soviet apparatnik highway lane? Imagine again full open access. The scholarly apparatus would be democratized. The democratic web would turn scholarly. And, to echo my earlier quote from the leopard, this is not a newfangled or politically radical vision. To quote George II, who in 1759 donated his library to the newly opened British Library, quote, "Though chiefly designed for the use of learned and studious men, both native and foreigners, in their researches into several arts of knowledge, yet being a national establishment, the advantages accruing from this library should be rendered as general as possible," unquote. Nearly a century later, in 1836, the then head of the British Library, Antonio Panizzi, confirmed George II's vision of a free public access. Quote, "I want a poor student to have the same means of indulging his learned curiosity, of following his rational pursuits, of consulting the same authorities, of fathoming the most intricate enquiry, as the richest man in the kingdom, as far as books go. And I contend that the government is bound to give him the most liberal and unlimited assistance in this respect." Nearly 2 centuries later, The government's most liberal and unlimited assistance remains a moral imperative. Salaried intellectuals must share their research with the public. The American people, and indeed all people of the world, deserve nothing less. Open access embodies what makes America great, its democratic, egalitarian, innovative spirit. Thank you.
So I want to remind you that there's a panel discussion tomorrow, but she will take some questions if you have some now. So ask away.
So I wonder if you could say a little more about publicly funded and what exactly that means, because one can argue that all scholarship isn't publicly funded. And would your moral argument still hold for scholarship that hasn't actually been funded by the government? I mean, California, we can hardly say that we're being publicly funded. It's going in the opposite direction. So if you could speak to what you mean precisely by publicly funded.
Publicly funded either by research grants or by tax breaks. I'm a private philanthropist, but I get tax breaks for giving away money. So that is, in effect, a public funding. I think one could make a strong argument that student fees, which also are treated generously in various ways, Pell Grants and so on, as well as the research grants, as well as all the tax breaks for philanthropy, in different way, all make up public funding. It's just different mechanisms.
I was going to ask the last question as well. I think it's a good question, but and I don't mean to be joking here, but should we give up those little checks that come from Copyright Center? In other words, my point is, aren't we participating in exactly the kind of rip-off that you're suggesting through these agreements by various players in the copyright game?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Where should I deposit my check?
Well, I'm supposed to wait until tomorrow on the panel to ask this, and so I'm part of that, but this is not what I had planned to say then. It occurs to me that there are two models that I could recognize for funding the circulation of knowledge or virtually anything on the internet. One is the advertising model, and the other is the paywall model. So what you're suggesting seems to ask for a different kind of model. And I wonder if you have further thoughts on what that third other model would be.
Well, I simply think that the last mile of disseminating research should be baked into the research grants and baked into the university's budgets. I have never understood why we're prepared to pay for 95% and then start worrying about commercial models for the last 5% of the road.
The extension of copyright is only one of many trends which seems to give power to the dead that are going on in this society now. The celebrity cult, the fact that when you die, your rights are sold or can be sold, and if they're not sold, you will be sued, is all part of a general trend which needs to be addressed not simply in terms of copyright issues, but the whole question of individualism as opposed to a community sense.
I very much agree with that.
I didn't have a question actually, but I wanted to say that I admired very much what you had to say. And one of the moments that I took away that struck me particularly was when you identified academic publication as a public good, because that's one of the catchwords that's being used in political debates right now about healthcare, for example, and that kind of thing. And your evocation of the Civil War in the earlier part of your talk, and the fact that there are so many Americans who are completely obsessed with their private investigation into the Civil War, and the positive impact that it could have to open up actual articles by historians to these people who spend their lives basically researching this kind of thing, really makes me feel that you have an extremely valid point here. I just wanted to underscore the idea of a public good.
Thank you.
I had two questions. First, I wanted you to parse your title. I wanted to understand who the guards and guardians were, because I got scared that, those evil journal bundlers are our guardians. But the other question I wanted to ask, my only reservation in your brilliant talk was your assertion that we all agree that taxpayers have a right to expect return, et cetera. And I guess my reservation is in the current discourse, one hears all the time, I'm a taxpayer, why are they using my money like that, right? That is, there's a kind of implication that when I pay taxes, I am paying for services that benefit me rather than the community in general. And so I'm wondering if you see a kind of danger once we publish scholarship for the public to say, that doesn't benefit me, I'm not paying for it anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I mean, I'm framing it this way partly because it's how commentators on the web frame it. This seems to be a very common view. But going back also to your point, it's a rather crude and primitive view. However, if you extend it out, not from the one individual taxpayer, and talk not in terms of taxpayers, but in terms of a citizenry and the community of a citizenry, then I think it starts making sense. I mean, I should perhaps add that of your enormous and very generous federal research budgets, about half goes to military research. So that, of course, will not be part of this anyhow. But the other half could be, perhaps.
I am not a member of the UC Berkeley community, but rather a resident of San Francisco. The San Francisco Public Library makes available online the OED, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, OCLC, and JSTOR. And not only may any resident of San Francisco have that access, but any resident of California may if they apply for a library card. So that means that however many millions now live in California, let's say 40 million, through the San Francisco Public Library have access to these online databases, including the one that you make special mention of, JSTOR. So my question is this just an aberration? Is this what some libraries are starting to do? Are we essentially going to get what you want through this kind of effort by enlightened librarians? Or is this strictly an exception that proves your rule that open access is not really happening?
From my talks with JSTOR, I would say that's very much the exception. They are terrified of it. As of 2007, and that's of course rather long ago, about 3,500 institutions in the world subscribed to JSTOR. So even the institution subscription base was small. And JSTOR is guarded very closely by the publishers who sort of make up or own what's in that particular bundle. And they are not they're decent people. And if it was up to the guys who run it, they would just throw the doors open tomorrow. But they can't do that. And the publishers are very clear on why they can't do that. Because they're so afraid of letting go of something they think may have value. They'd rather keep it locked up and not get much out of it.
Some of us who have been involved in the academic nonprofit publishing world think that there's a great deal of value added in academic publishing. What happens to it, in your view, with open access? The value of editing, selection, promotion of works, and so forth?
Well, there's nothing that prevents gold standard, PLOS, peer-reviewed type of open access publishing. And we will always have a hierarchy of quality in our journal publishing, whether it's open access and closed access. So I think it's two separate questions. One is a question of how you charge for the knowledge. The other is a question about how you assemble the knowledge and with what safeguards you assemble the knowledge. I think most of us have done a lot of that work for free, both for non-profits and for profits. And there is something unseemly about these superbly specialized people, the professoriate, sort of doing that for free and then giving it to highly commercial publishers. Tony Marks, who's the head of the New York Public Library, told me once that the commercial journal publishers are very popular objects for private equity firms because the margins are second to, there are no other industry in the world that have such high margins. And he told me, having a discussion with a young banker who sort of enthusiastically said that, I can't believe this model. They give it to us, you know. And I don't really see why we give it away and then have to buy it back.
I can't resist this because some of us publish with university presses. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges is that your model would undermine the meager financial support that they have now. The university press that I published with over the course of 2 books got much weaker and have less capability for providing editing, marketing, any of the things they do. Yeah. So how do you propose to address that? We all hate Elsevier, so that's kind of easy. It's an easy target. But what about Harvard University Press?
Oh, and we're beginning to hate university presses as well because they are becoming more and more commercial, aren't they? They're becoming less and less willing to to make public highly specialized monographs, for example. And they're editing less and less. And I think simply that they should sort of go back to the universities they belong to and be again part of the overhead that comes from research grants and so on. There is one hopeful thing about that, though, which is that some experimentation has shown, although unfortunately I don't remember which press it was, but a reputable university press, that by making a monograph open access online, you can actually increase the paper sales. So it's not proven that the model is wholly unsustainable.
That's the National Academy of Science.
There you go.
We seem to be drawn to the P's, and one P that hasn't been mentioned yet is patents. And I'm sure you've thought a lot about whether you want to bring the patent system into your plans because it offers some strength. The university treats patents in a very different way than it treats our literary rights. Also, there are striking instances of great innovation, both in our country and abroad, where patents played no role in development. The American railroad system in the 19th century, and until fairly recent times, Swiss pharmaceuticals. Would you care to say something on patents that might strengthen or might raise new questions about your argument.
Well, my only two comments on patents, and they are unrelated to each other, is that it seems to me that the notion that what professors produced on paid time is also in some meaningful sense the property as well of the university, as well as the individual researchers, seems fairer to me than the rather peculiar notion of the social sciences and humanities, where the initial ownership of the research on salaried time belongs only to the scholar who produced it. And the second thing I would say about patents is that, exactly as you say, and I'm now speaking from my experience as an industrialist, patents are often overvalued. The sort of knowledge complex that makes up a successful industry tend to be about other barriers to entry than patents.
I'm going to ask the same question that's been asked a few times. I have this very, very literal imagination, so I want to do the math. So I'm an historian, and it's wonderful to have you here as a graduate of our department. And I write about Japanese history, and I publish a book, let's say, every 8 or 9 years. So work that out. And I'm working on one now. And the University of California Press will probably publish it. And it will probably cost them, at today's prices, for all of this value added with really excellent editing in the Cal case, a little bit of publicity and good artwork and intelligent design work. It'll probably cost them $15,000 to $20,000 to do that, right, folks? Okay, so my research is funded. Well, for example, I was at a research institute in Kyoto that gave me basically a little allowance. Or I'm on a sabbatical funded by my excellent sabbatical units and some help from the Humanities Research Fellowship Fund. There's no big investor in me.
No.
And this is true, as you know, of most of my colleagues. So let's say to get that book done to standard and nicely but freely refereed by other peers who get $200 worth of Cal books if they help. So what? That's a big boon. So let's say in order to get this publicly accessible, hooray, we want this, I need, or my publisher needs, the $15,000. And let's multiply that by 8 people a year in my department or let 10 because the math is easier. That's $150,000 per year for this one magnificent history department. But none of those people can easily build that to, well, maybe I could imagine. By and large, we can't build that into the overhead of our research funding. So just to go back to this very sort of simple-minded, literal question, I'm sorry to impose this on you. How am I going to get that stuff publicly accessible? My book.
From your university library not having to buy all those journals and academic monographs. And there is the problem, because this is a system that would work if it was introduced all at once. It's very hard to introduce piecemeal. But the cost of keeping up with commercially sold knowledge for your university as a whole would pay for the publication, high-quality edited publications of the sort you describe.
Could you do that once more?
So, yeah, you should. Yeah.
Tom, yes,
we spend about $15 million a year to buy works such as the one you're writing.
yeah.
we add 100,000 volumes. Some of those would not really resemble the kind of monograph you're writing, and some of them might be free. But those are the other simple numbers, and we can work on the math later.
Thank you.
But it's unlikely, I think, that the scholars of the university would produce so many works compared to all the works you have taken in from all other scholars from all other universities, that the balance wouldn't work out.
Have you done the spreadsheet?
No, but it would not be unlikely. I mean, how much do you pay for the journals?
$29 million a year across UC.
Oh, I'm sorry.
How much do you pay for the journals?
I can defer to Ivy Anderson, who's about to answer this. She's the person who buys a lot of stuff.
We spend system-wide about $29 million for scholarly journals for resources that we license across the system. One of the challenges of this discussion is, or this notion is, and those who have studied the economics have identified that as a system, the overall systemic cost could be lower if publication were funded upfront through publication fees and so on and so forth, and the infrastructure was not using commercial infrastructure and so forth. But the challenge is the distribution of those costs across the system.
Yes, exactly.
Because research-intensive institutions will take on a larger share of that burden, and lesser publishing institutions, and of course the general public will not take as much of a share. And that redistribution of costs is where the spreadsheets come in. It's actually quite challenging, I think, to re-engineer the system as a whole and figure out how that's going to be possible.
It's very challenging, and it's one of those things that if one institution does it, they immediately go bankrupt. If all institutions did it, it would work. I'm not saying that the total overall dissemination costs would be lowered, but I'm quite sure that if we sort of scraped away those 40% margins we talked about, there would be space for well-edited monographs.
Last question.
Let me add 2 facts to this little debate. From the viewpoint of the National Endowment for the Humanities, where I funded research for many, many years, we've worried about this. And it is generally the case in the humanities that the number of books, number of monographs published has declined, at least in my career, from 10,000 to 2,000. This is true across the board.
Yeah.
One of the causes of this is precisely the increasing amount of money that libraries must invest in scholarly publications, scholarly journals, particularly, of course, science private publishers. Now, we actually did some work on this a while ago, and one of the interesting things is maybe a key to the political question of mobilizing university leaderships, and that is that on any given elite campus like this one, the interests of the press are not aligned with the library. And to work out that alignment of interests, even in a small subset, would go a long way to addressing this issue.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, let's thank Lisbet Rausing.